We can cite examples of where people get their memories off, but our memories are generally reliable. And especially when you have multiple independent eyewitness sources or sources closely rooted in eyewitness testimony, it certainly increases the probability that what they were reporting is true.
Hello, everyone. We're live. I'm here with Mike Lacuna. He's a professor of New Testament studies at Houston Christian University, author of many books on the New Testament, one of the world's leading experts on the minimal facts argument for the resurrection. Mike, thanks so much for being here. Do you want to just start by kind of like telling us who you are, I guess?
Sure. Well, I'm 62 years old, grew up in Baltimore, became a Christian around the age of 10. Of course, my epistemological processes weren't really developed at that point. So when I was in grad school, I started to really question my faith. One of my roommates recommended I talk to Gary Habermas, and so I did. He was a philosophy professor. I was New Testament, so I had never had him for a course, but he was very welcoming, and I told him I was having my doubts. And at that point, as a Christian, I was just looking for reassurance of my faith, and he turned me on to the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and 20, 30 minutes later, I walked out of his office feeling pretty good. Later on, I was really trying to think through some of the objections that I was hearing to Christianity, and the doubts started coming back. And I recognized that, I had just, when I spoke with him, I was just looking for a reassurance of my faith, rather than really just stepping back and asking, is this stuff really true? And investigating it for myself. I ended up doing a PhD in New Testament, but focusing on the philosophy of history and historical method. And I wanted to approach the matter of Jesus's resurrection as a historian would. And so I spent a few years studying how historians, look at these things and what kind of approaches they take to it. One of the things that they appear to be unanimous about, and there's very few things that carries that kind of a consensus among historians, but one of the things they do seem unanimous about is that there is no such thing as an unbiased historian, and that our own worldviews and desired outcomes definitely have the potential to compromise the integrity of our investigation. And I knew that applied to me as a Christian because I wanted to see that Jesus rose from the dead. And so, I got thinking, I don't have to fear truth. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, I'd want to know that. The time for my doctoral work, the average dissertation for a PhD is 60 to 80,000 words. I just became consumed with this and seeking truth. And so mine ended up being over 250,000 words. And during that period, I also engaged, after a few years in putting together an argument, I engaged in public debates with some leading skeptics. And I wanted to see if what I was presenting could withstand tough critical scrutiny. And so that's kind of my story on the resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah. So one of your sort of main argument that you're known for is the minimal facts argument. So you say there are these core historical bedrock facts that are agreed upon by the vast majority of New Testament historians and that are firmly established on historical grounds. And then you'll say that the resurrection is the best or the only plausible explanation of the various facts. Do you want to just sort of lay out what the minimal facts are?
Sure. And by the way, you know what? The minimal facts approach that Gary Habermas takes is a little bit different than the one that I take. But a lot of historians follow this kind of thinking because there are a lot of things that, before I get into the facts, I just want to clarify. There are a lot of things that historians don't agree on, and what some acknowledge as facts, others won't. So a number will say, the empty tomb is a fact. Others will say, no, it's not a fact. So since historians disagree on so much, Paula Fredrickson at Boston University, who is a Jewish historian of Jesus, she's not a Christian, and she refers to some facts as historical bedrock. These would be kind of the minimal facts that Gary refers to. Historical bedrock, facts past doubting, and the whole idea behind historical bedrock is these are the facts upon which you want to build your hypothesis. And if a hypothesis cannot accommodate those facts, then that hypothesis needs to be revised or jettisoned. So what constitutes these historical bedrock? Well, they've got to be strongly supported by the data, and that's the most important thing. But since historians do not agree on all facts, then not only must they be supported strongly by the data, but you've got to have a very strong majority of historians who grant them as facts. And in that case, then they become a minimal fact or historical bedrock, whatever you would call it. So related to Jesus' resurrection, you would have things such as Jesus' death by crucifixion, that shortly thereafter, a number of his followers had experiences they interpreted as appearances of the risen Jesus to them. Now, that's virtually 100% of historians. A heterogeneous consensus of historians will grant those. Probably about 80%, maybe a little bit better, will grant that some of these experiences occurred to group settings. And then about 100% again will grant that a skeptic, a persecutor of the church named Paul, had an experience that he likewise interpreted as an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. And it radically transformed his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. So those would be facts that are granted by nearly all, except that one about the group appearances, and that enjoys about an 80% consensus.
Yeah, so I think I would be happy to grant the minimal facts, to grant at least almost all of them. That, I think Jesus obviously died by crucifixion. I think that years after his death, many of his disciples believed themselves to have had group appearances. So the story in Paul about appearing to the 500 isn't just made up. I think that Bart Ehrman's hypothesis, where he suggests that there could have been stories that grew over time, such that there are often stories where people misremember things years down the line. Where he has a blog post where he gives the example of, you have this big, if you ask people if they saw some famous event of some plane hitting some building in the Netherlands or something, lots of people say they can remember when they saw it. Well, there was no recording of it. It never saw it, but people can develop these incorrect group memories. So I think it's possible that it sort of grew over time and grew grander. But so I guess, I'll just lay out sort of my basic objection to the minimal facts approach, and then you can sort of describe where you think I go wrong. So I agree. I think anybody is going to have to think that any non-Christian is going to have to think something kind of weird happened in first century Roman Palestine. This charismatic leader, Jesus, lots of people who didn't seem to be crazy. He, went to his death, and then a lot of people said that they saw him after his death. I'm not so sold on the empty tomb, but it's at least there's the evidence for the empty tomb is good enough that it's at least suspicious. Where you have to think something weird happened, where for some reason, in their earliest reports in Mark, they said that it was women who saw the tomb, which is a little weird. That's not what you'd expect. So I think everyone's going to have to think that something kind of strange happened. And then Paul and James and so on converted, which isn't what you would expect. But my view is, I think that while a naturalist will have to think something weird happened, I think that so will a Christian, where just the Christian hypothesis is not a much better explanation, given that even if you're to believe it, you have to first think that God exists. You have to also think that God is sort of in the business of carrying out miracles. Then you have to think that he would want to carry out a miracle in first century Roman Palestine, and that he is sort of this Trinity who would send his son, and then would resurrect his son.
Right, hang on a second, Matthew. You're throwing a lot down right now.
Yeah.
Okay? I disagree that you have to believe all those things. First of all, you don't have to believe there's a Trinity. That is a theological doctrine. It's not a historical one. In other words, there's no way that you could prove that there's a Trinity. We can say that the early Christians may have believed a Trinity, but you don't have to believe in a Trinity in order to get to the resurrection of Jesus any more than you have to believe that his death atones for sin in order to believe that he died by crucifixion. You don't have to believe God exists in order to acknowledge that Jesus rose from the dead. So here's an example I gave in a debate with Ehrman a couple of years ago. I'll present it before you. So let's say that astronomers have been tracking a comet now for a few years, and they know that it's going to hit the moon on a certain day and time. And when that day arrives, then you have the Hubble Space Telescope that's positioned to really zoom in on the moon's surface and a few planetariums around the globe. And at the appointed time, the comet slams into the moon's surface. And as the lunar dust settles, there's a message written on the moon's surface, and it says, Jesus is Lord. And it's written in Hebrew and in Greek. Now, here's what a good scientist would do. The good scientist, an astronomer, would say, wow, that's an extraordinary event to say the least. I have no plausible natural explanation for it. It certainly would seem to require a miracle or God. But as a scientist, I don't have the tools to be able to detect God. And so all I'm going to do, I can affirm the occurrence of the event, but I'm just going to have to leave the cause of the event undetermined, because the evidence for the event itself, whether the scientists believed in God ahead of time, the evidence for the event itself would be sufficient to establish that it occurred. You just couldn't be able to, as a scientist, having the tools of science to be able to affirm that God did it. Now, here's what a poor astronomer would do. A poor scientist would say, well, that's an extraordinary event, and I certainly don't have any plausible natural explanations for it. It would seem to require God or a supernatural cause of some sort, but unfortunately, as a scientist, I don't have the tools necessary in order to say that God did it, and so I'm just not even going to affirm that the event itself occurred. Now, of course, that would be lunacy, but that is exactly the position that a number of New Testament critical, skeptical New Testament scholars take. And so, no, I don't think you have to be able to believe that God exists to affirm the resurrection. You can affirm that the event itself occurred, and then just leave the cause of the event undetermined. Now, maybe you'd say, well, God would be the best cause of the resurrection if it actually occurred. I agree. But that's something that you would determine after deciding that Jesus rose from the dead based on the data. So the question is, are the data strong enough to show that Jesus probably rose from the dead, or that it's the best explanation of the data?
Yeah. Well, when evaluating whether some hypothesis is the best explanation of the data, you'll look at the probability of that hypothesis. So, you can come up with all sorts of theories that would predict the evidence of the resurrection that are just not at all believable, involving strange supernatural forces. But those aren't a good theory because you don't have a reason to think that a being like that would want to resurrect Jesus in particular. Now, if you have the broadly Christian story, then you have a theory of why God would resurrect Jesus. And so I agree with you that if the evidence were as good as for, like, we see with the comet and it hits it and the moon's and the dust settles and it says Jesus is Lord, because that would be so surprising. So, I mean, they should affirm that it happened just because they observed that it happened. And then they should say, what's the best explanation of that? Well, the Christians have a good explanation of that. That's much better than the other theories. So I think they should think, okay, probably that'll at least be very strong evidence for Christianity. Maybe it's not, I think at that point that would be enough to make Christianity probably the right view. And so I think in a similar way here, you should think that there's good historical evidence that is well explained by the resurrection. But then the question is, if you think that resurrections are inherently improbable, this is not to say they're impossible or that we should be methodological naturalists. I don't think any of that. But if you just think resurrections in general don't happen, especially to think that a resurrection like this happens, you have to believe a lot of stuff that's pretty improbable. Then you should think that various naturalistic explanations, even if they're not great explanations and require sort of jumping through a lot of hoops, are better explanations than that there was a resurrection.
Okay, so let me ask you this, Matthew. Why do you think a resurrection is improbable?
Well, I think so resurrections are improbable in normal cases, just because we know that most people don't resurrect. The reason I think that a resurrection, in the case of Jesus specifically, where he's a special case, where, like, if anyone's going to be resurrected, like, if I know that some resurrections have happened, okay, Jesus is by far the best candidate for being resurrected.
And why would you say that?
Well, the reason I say that is because there's much better evidence that he was resurrected than that anyone else in history was resurrected.
Okay. I would also add the context in which it happens. So Virtually all historians of Jesus, no matter how skeptical, acknowledge that Jesus came on the scene claiming to have a special relationship with God who had chosen him to usher in his kingdom, that he taught in parables, that he performed deeds that astonished crowds and that both he and his followers considered to be divine miracles and exorcisms, that he was crucified on the orders of Pontius Pilate at the instigation of the Jewish leadership, and that shortly thereafter, a number of his followers had experiences they interpreted as appearances of the risen Jesus. So he comes on the scene, and what we know about him that's agreed upon by virtually every scholar, historian of Jesus, again, it's not to say that it's true because scholars acknowledge it. I'm saying that the data is so strong that they're willing to acknowledge it across theological, philosophical spectrums. So it creates a context that's charged with religious significance, in which if these things about Jesus are true about some of his claims, then a resurrection wouldn't seem out of place.
Yeah.
So
Well,
not
so
only the evidence is better than it is for others, but the context in which it occurs shows that if what he was claiming about himself is true, then a resurrection would be normal.
yeah, yeah. So I guess I was including the context of some of the evidence.
Okay.
But right. So I agree with that.
But why is it improbable that he would be raised from the dead?
Well, I think it's so your explanation of why it's probable that he would be raised from the dead is that he had all this he had this grand messianic. He made all these grand messianic claims. He came with this radical vision of himself. He maybe predicted that he would be raised from the dead, etc. And so,
No, well, that's important. But the reason why I'd say it's probable that he was raised is because, given the evidence, when you weigh the evidence, the resurrection hypothesis explains the data better than competing hypotheses, and does so by a significant margin.
yeah. But so my view is, I think when you think of the resurrection as just this one simple explanation, Jesus was raised from the dead, then it starts to look pretty good. Where the other explanations, you have to think, this one thing happened. Paul converted mysteriously as a result of some, for some unknown reason, and then so did James, his skeptical brother, and then maybe his tomb was found empty, and all these people. It starts to look really bad, because you have to posit that a variety of separate improbable things happened. But my claim is that I think you'll also have to posit that for the Christian story, where if your explanation of why it's likely that Jesus would be raised from the dead is, well, it's likely that God would raise Jesus from the dead, then you have to think God exists. You have to think that God would be in the business of doing miracles like raising Jesus from the dead.
Yeah, you have to be open to it. You don't have to believe it ahead of time, but you do have to be open to it.
Right. So, well, the explanation that God raises Jesus from the dead, it requires all of those things happening. And so my view is, I think that for there, you have to think a lot of improbable things happened, just like you have to for the traditional.
But why are these things improbable? We get back to that question. Why is it improbable? Why do you regard it as being improbable?
Well, so for the existence of God, that I'm about 50-50 on. That's a whole, big can of worms. But that'll, I think,
let's say 50-50 then, all right?
Yeah, right.
So
That'll
if you
depend
had
on your
50-50,
philosophical views.
So then it's neither probable nor improbable in that case.
Well, if it's 50-50, like, that'll still lower the probability, because you have to have it requires one more thing that only has a 50% probability. And so that will lower the probability. Then obviously that wouldn't be enough on its own. I also, I have a view where I think if you think God is in the business of intervening in the natural world, then it becomes very mysterious why he doesn't perform many more miracles than he does, why he didn't, intervene miraculously to, kill Hitler or something, or to, like, bring about all sorts of great goods. And so I think that the best explanation of that, of the seeming absence of miracles, is what a theist should think is two things. One, that the apparent miracles, like Our Lady of Zatoun and so on, the things that are actually pretty well evidenced, that they are performed by various other supernatural entities that are not God, so like by angels and demons and stuff like that. But that God himself is not in the business of carrying out miracles, because if he is, then it's so mysterious why there aren't more miracles. And so if you have a view like that, and I'm not certain of a view like that, but if you have a view like that, if you think it's at least plausible, that's going to be another thing that lowers the probability of the hypothesis. And I think there are like 7 or 8 of these things that will lower the probability of the hypothesis, that make it overall so that it doesn't do so well.
Yeah, well, Okay, so next month, my wife and I will have been married for 37 years. And I can
Congratulations.
tell you, having lived with her now for 37 years next month, that she still does things that I don't understand. And I think anybody who's been married for a while will say, man, I no, I've been married 50, 60 years and I still don't understand my wife why she does some things. Now, if that's the case with a person that we know better than anyone else in this world and have lived with for so long and see them in front of us and be able to talk with them and look at their facial expressions and things like this, then I should, and I still can't really understand them fully, then it shouldn't surprise me if I don't understand God, why he runs the universe the way he does. I mean, he doesn't consult me. All right. But there are things that we could say. Let's just take your example with Hitler. Why didn't he cause a miscarriage with Adolf Hitler at some point? It seems like that would have um, um, avoided a whole lot of suffering. You know, we can only speculate there, but let me just throw something out to you as a possibility. Okay, no way to confirm it or anything, but I think it's a plausible explanation. You know, at that point, the nuclear bomb had not been discovered and or developed. It was in the process, but it had not been developed, and certainly hadn't even been in the beginning phases when Hitler was born. Suppose God, looking through history, and says, you know what? Um, there are going to be despots all along. And if we have someone as evil as Hitler back in the 15th century, something like this, yeah, he'll do some evil things, but people will forget about it. If we have him in the 21st century, then he will have all kinds of technology that will be available to him, and he will be able to wreak a whole lot more havoc than if he exists in the 20th century. So I'm going to allow Hitler, a guy named Hitler, to exist in the 20th century, who's going to cause a whole lot of pain and suffering and evil in the world. And people are going to look and say, we're never going to allow that to happen again. And it's going to happen right on the cusp of the nuclear age at the best time to allow this to minimize human suffering in the future. So maybe God, knowing all history, knowing all possible worlds, and as a philosophy major, I know you know what I mean by possible worlds. Maybe him knowing all possible worlds was able to look and make sure the one was actualized that would create the least amount of pain, evil, and suffering, and on
Yeah.
balance, the greatest amount of good.
Yeah, so that's always possible. It's always possible to tell some just so story about why something happened. But given how, uh, miracles, maybe they do happen, maybe they don't, but they're at least pretty rare. I think, there aren't very many of them happening in these very visible contexts. And so if you think that, they're very rare, then for each one that doesn't happen, it's very mysterious why, because there are so many things where it seems like there might be a good reason for God to do them. And so it becomes mysterious why for each one of them. And then you multiply the probability that he wouldn't do the miracle here, or maybe, stopping COVID from jumping from bats to people, and just all sorts of miracles. So I think the better explanation is that God just is not in the business. He could do miracles, but he has some morally sufficient reason in general not to do miracles. Maybe there are rare exceptions,
But
but
if you have some decent evidence for miracles, enough of them, it doesn't matter how frequent they are or how abundant they are. And you could also account for why would he do these miracles? I mean, if the Christian view is correct, okay, the narrative is that sin and disobedience to God has originally brought the evil, pain, and suffering into the world. The world has fallen as a result of that. God does not rescue us from that necessarily. He will in the end, but what he does is work in a way that ultimately we can be redeemed from that. And it seems like a lot of the miracles that we find Jesus performing in the New Testament was to reveal who he was. And a lot of the miracles that we see going on in the world today is to reveal who Jesus is. He allows pain and evil and suffering to let us know that there is something definitely wrong in our world today. perhaps even to draw us closer to him, to seek him. It's in the countries where there's the greatest amount of pain, evil, and suffering that people are really seeking God, and that Christianity is growing faster. So there could be reasons why he doesn't do certain miracles in different places, but there are plenty of examples of miracles out there. I mean, talk to Craig Keener, read some of his books. He's got 2 volumes on miracles, in which there are hundreds of miracles that he mentions, and quite a few of them are documented by more than one source. Even in modern times, you've got physicians who are able to document medical miracles that are taking place. I know a guy named Loy Reed who was in a coma for 21 days, and this was back in 1987. And on the 21st day, it was July 4th, 1987. A number of members of his church got together. They were celebrating 4th of July at a local park. And at 4:00 in the afternoon, a bunch of them got together to pray for Loy, who was miles away in the hospital. And granted, remember, he'd been in a coma for 21 days at this point. And they prayed for him at 4 p.m. And at 4 p.m., Loy came out of his coma. And it gets kind of even more interesting because before midnight, everyone else in that ward who was in a coma, and all of them had been in a coma from 1 to 6 months, every last one of them came out of their coma. So
Wow.
it seems to me that we do have some modern miracles. I can tell you of an instance. I can say this one real quickly. Back in, it was probably 1988, 89. I had a martial arts school at that time, and I took an exhibition team down to Ocean City, Maryland. We performed on the boardwalk, and there was a church we were staying in. I believe it was a Mennonite church, which is kind of interesting because they're pacifists. So it's like, here we are, martial artists, and these pacifists are allowing us to camp out in their church for a few days. And this day it was just pouring down rain, and they said, "Well, Mike, are we going to perform on the boardwalk today?" So I don't think so, but tell you what, we perform on the boardwalk, and then I give a gospel presentation to the crowd who's come to watch it. And so I said, this is God's ministry. Let's just get in the van, drive down to the boardwalk, and see what happens. So it rained all the way down. Soon as we pulled into our parking place, it stopped raining. I said, "Well, this is kind of interesting. Let's check this out." So we got out of the van, we went up on the boardwalk, got to the part where there's the stage, and of course it was just soaked with water. And I said, "We're not going to be able to do this." Well, just then, the store that was on the other side of the boardwalk, the manager came out and said, "Hey, could you use some towels to clean off the stage?" I said, "Yeah, that'd be fantastic." They gave us a bunch of towels, and we cleaned off the stage, but it was still kind of damp. And it's just like, no way we're going to do this with these jump spinning kicks and stuff like this on the boardwalk. We'll really hurt ourselves. So it's like, no, we can't do this. Well, then just then, this strong wind came off the ocean and blew the stage dry. And so we got up there, we performed, and afterward I was given a gospel presentation, and just as I was finishing, it started to drizzle. We finished, we packed it up, put in, bam, it starts raining again. I was like, wow, that's kind of a nature miracle. And my friend Craig Keener, he testifies about a nature miracle that he's even seen. So I do think that miracles happen today. We may not see them every day that's going on, but there are a number of them that are going on today. They're occurring in the U.S., they're occurring overseas. A lot of these things will happen. Boy, I'll move on, but others are coming to mind right now that I could mention.
So I haven't read Keener's book, but I did read Dale Allison's book, Encountering Mystery, and I was really blown away by how persuasive the evidence was for a lot of that stuff. But I think that can be explained in the way I described, where you think that there are other supernatural entities, like maybe angels or something, or demons, where, and I know you're sort of sympathetic to thinking that some miracles can be explained that way, or you think maybe that's behind some of the Marian apparitions. And so, yeah, I think there's solid evidence for miracles. But the point is, if you, I think it becomes easier to solve the problem of evil if you think God broadly doesn't intervene in the world, where it becomes easier to see why, for instance, there were so many millions of years of evolutionary suffering, where you can have this theodical explanation where you say, well, God wanted to put us roughly in a universe that was in a universe that looks like a universe it would look like that's indifferent to our existence. Now, he'd provide the necessary furnishings for like fine tuning and such. So, it would have to have us in order for us to be there. So it would be fine tuned, and it would have have certain other things, like it would have harmonious psychophysical laws. So you can still use the evidence for theism, but I think that's the best explanation of like why, for instance, there's so much animal suffering in the world. But if you have that explanation, then I think that makes it very hard to believe in the resurrection. Now, I'm not saying I'm certain of any of this, but my claim is my basic view is I agree with you. The naturalistic explanations aren't great, but my claim is I also think the Christian explanation isn't great. Where in both cases there are like a lot of different things that you'll have to believe, where each of them in particular is not super likely, and then you just stack together, maybe some of them aren't that bad, but you just stack together the claims. Whereas it's similar for the naturalistic explanations, where, okay, you can tell a story about why Paul would convert. Maybe he was feeling bad about persecuting people. Maybe he had a hallucination or something. Maybe he was schizophrenic. There are all sorts of things you could say. And it's the thing that makes the naturalistic explanations a little bit troublesome is that you just have to think that a lot of different improbable things happened. But my claim is that's sort of similar in the Christian explanation.
But by the way, you said, okay, well, some of these miracles that could be explained by, say, an angel or demon or something like that. All right, you've presented a possibility there. I agree, it could be that way. But merely positing that as a possibility, I look at this and I'm saying, okay, Jesus comes on the scene. He claims to be God's uniquely divine son. He's performing deeds that astonish crowds and things like that. If we grant a little bit more, which I would gladly argue for, that he claims to be God's uniquely divine son, that he's predicting his imminent death and resurrection, I think we've got very good historical evidence for that. It wouldn't be one of those historical bedrock, but I think we've got really good data for it. And then we see miraculous events, especially those that are done in the name of Jesus around the world. Well, you can say it's an angel, but it's certainly all compatible with the Christian worldview. You acknowledge that there is the appearance of design in the universe and life, which I'm glad you do that. Even Richard Dawkins is willing to do that. So if we're willing to say, yeah, there's some supernatural things that do happen in the world today, and it does seem that some miracles occur. Yeah, we can't prove that it's God doing it rather than an angel or a demon. But wow, if you've got a pastor who lays his hands on a child that has been bitten by a snake 6 hours previously, they've turned blue and they haven't bled for hours. By the way, I'm referring to the sister of Craig Keener's wife, that this happened. And so she was dead for a few hours. And then a pastor prays over her and she starts breathing again and coming back to life. I've got every reason to think that it was God who did that, the God of this pastor who did it. And that God, it's not just a deistic universe, it's a theistic one. And if God raised Jesus from the dead, that's another reason to believe that we live in a theistic rather than deistic reality.
Yeah. So I'm not suggesting, to be clear, I'm not suggesting literal deism, where I'm not saying that there is just like a being outside of the world who creates it and then leaves things. My claim is he doesn't intervene while the world's going on, so he intervenes to have an afterlife. And I think that's the only way, as far as I can tell, that you can have a plausible story of why there's so much evil in the world, where you say there's something really valuable about God broadly non-intervening in the world, which explains why, for instance, he created us through this inefficient and grisly natural process of evolution by natural selection, which took place over the course of billions of years and had like many quadrillions of animals live the vast majority of the time these really short lives of very intense suffering. So and now I think it's true that it's not certain. I could be wrong about this, but I think it'll just cut the probability. And now if you admit that the possibility of angels and demons, then I think you can tell a very good story of the resurrection, where you just say, okay, maybe an angel resurrected Jesus from the dead. Why would they do that? Well, for exactly the same reason that that Christians point to about the positive moral transformations brought about by Christianity. Christianity had this really positive effect on the world, brought about this very profound moral and spiritual transformation of the world. It really reshaped the values of the world. That seems like something that a benevolent supernatural entity would be in the business of bringing out. And I think that theory is going to be. I think it'll be better than Christianity, or even the theory that God raised Jesus from the dead.
Why? Why?
Yeah. Well, I think it'll be better because I think Christianity has requires believing a lot of implausible things. So,
and this thing with the angel, for all your pure speculation of why the angel may have wanted to raise Jesus, you think that is less speculation?
well, I think, but I mean, both of them are speculation, right? One is speculation. So there are three theories. Okay, theory one: God raised Jesus from the dead in order to vindicate him and to vindicate the Christian message.
Right.
Theory two,
and that enjoys Jesus predicting his death and resurrection that will be a vindication of his message in order to support it. Okay.
yeah.
So it's not ad hoc to hold that position.
Well, I don't know. I think it still is ad hoc.
Why would it be ad hoc? If Jesus is predicting his death and resurrection in order to serve as a vindication of what he's teaching, then if Jesus is raised from the dead, why would the claim that Jesus was raised from the dead be ad hoc?
Well, just because someone predicts something in advance does not necessarily mean that it's not ad hoc.
If someone predicts something in advance and then the event occurs, and we're saying that the reason it happened is for the reason the person gave for predicting it, in other words, Jesus' vindication, well, then it's not ad hoc to say that God raised him from the dead. But to just say that there was an angel that raised Jesus from the dead for the benefit of mankind, or however you put it, that would be entirely ad hoc. There's no claim for it or anything like that. You're just positing it out of thin air. That's ad hoc.
Well, okay. I mean, so you could have the view, like a similar view in the vicinity where maybe Jesus was an angel or was consulting with, or something like that. But I don't know why it would be less. Well, so I mean, for one, I don't find the evidence as convincing as you do that Jesus predicted his that Jesus claimed in advance.
The evidence for it?
Sorry?
Have you looked at the evidence that Jesus predicted his imminent death and resurrection?
I haven't looked at it that carefully, but I've looked at it a little bit.
Okay.
But do you want to sort of lay out what you think is the best evidence for it?
Well, sure. Number one, it's in the earliest gospel, Mark. Two, we find multiple independent sources. So you find it not only in Mark, but you find it in the Q material where he's predicting his imminent death and resurrection. And you find it multiply attested in terms of a motif throughout the Gospels, which would seem to suggest that this is a motif that is going around, that Jesus predicts his imminent death and resurrection. That motif had to be earlier, much earlier than the reports in which it's occurring. So it's early. And also Mark, the early church tradition is that Mark is writing down what he remembered Peter saying. And Peter would have been an eyewitness. And I can tell you, I supervised the master's thesis of a student, Josh Pelletier, who's following up with it and expanded it even further into other languages in his doctoral PhD work. But he surveyed more than 200 critical scholars writing in English since 1965, and he found that a majority of scholars who comment on it do think that the traditional authorship of Mark is correct and that Peter was Mark's primary source. And I think that's based on some really good reasons for thinking that that's the case, that Peter was Mark's primary source. So that being the case, it's Mark's account is closely rooted in eyewitness testimony. John's gospel, the majority of critical scholars today do not think that John, the son of Zebedee, the traditional authorship, wrote the gospel, but they do think that the author was either a minor disciple of Jesus or that whoever the author was used one of Jesus' disciples, an eyewitness, as his primary source for a bulk of that gospel. So you'd have John and the predictions of Jesus' death and resurrection in John being rooted closely in eyewitness testimony. And of course, again, so you got rooted in eyewitness testimony early and multiple independent sources. And you also have an embarrassing kind of element to it too, because in Mark chapter 8, verses 31 through 33, this is where Jesus predicts his imminent death and resurrection. Peter pulls him aside and rebukes him for it. And then Jesus rebukes Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan. Why on earth would you invent something where you are dissing your lead apostle who's going to be the leader of your church? You wouldn't make up something like that." So there's a number of reasons to think that these imminent death and resurrection predictions are indeed historical.
Yeah. Well, so I think some of those could have spread through the oral tradition over time rather than have come directly from the eyewitnesses, and could, as a result of that, not have been accurate. But
Well, that's true. Maybe some of them did get dressed up a little bit, but the fact is you've got Mark writing down what he remembered Peter, an eyewitness, saying, and then at worst, you've got John writing down what he learned from an eyewitness of Jesus. And so this isn't like this long tradition of people handing down this tradition one to the next, to the next, to the next. At the very worst, it's got one person writing down what an eyewitness said Jesus said, and it's multiple independent sources.
yeah, yeah. Well, so I think that eyewitness memory of what happened, if they think that Jesus rose from the dead, sort of the stories could grow over time, where they end up falsely remembering that Jesus had claimed those things.
Well,
But
I understand you saying that, but you're pretty young. You're not old enough to be around for when 9/11 happened. But those of us who were around when 9/11 happened, we remember things such as what the weather was like that day. We remember where we were that day, and yet this only occurred once. Why do we remember what happened on 9/11, which was 23 years ago, as the time we're interviewing right now, but we don't remember what happened on September 11th last year in terms of the weather? Well, it's because it emotionally impacted us. And these kinds of things we remember. People who were around on December 7th when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor remember that. We remember
yeah,
these big events. People back in there, who are a little older than me, tell me they remember exactly where they were when they learned JFK was assassinated. So if you saw someone walk on water, you would remember that. If you saw someone raise the dead or be raised from the dead, you would remember that. You might confuse some details, but there's no question you would remember that event and you'd remember it vividly.
yeah. Well, so it's true that people will report exactly what they were doing on 9/11. But my understanding with studies that have looked into how reliable people's memories of those things are, where you ask them, people are like, "Yeah, I remember exactly where I was," and then when you investigate those things, they're often just completely wrong about the details. Where I can tell a personal example. When I have what I thought were pretty vivid memories of my bar mitzvah. But I think a few years ago, I discovered there were some big details that I just totally misremembered. Yeah, I was not born at the time of 9/11. But yeah, I think, yeah, so I think it's true that more memorable things will stick with people more, but that's not a perfect guide. People can still misremember things even if they,
Yeah, but they're going to
they
remember
think
the
were
gist,
impact. And if
right?
it's about specific statements that Jesus made, that seems like a plausible candidate for things, for parts of the resurrection. Or
And if
sorry,
he only made those things once, then I could see that be the case. But if the Gospels are even halfway accurate, he made these predictions several times. And so you would remember these things it'd be more inclined to remember it if it happened more than one time.
but I find it kind of plausible that it could have been like one person said they remembered it, and then the story spread over time, and then over time people started remembering it even if it hadn't happened, given just how fallible human memory is.
But then again, you have Mark reporting what Peter said, and you have the John's Gospel at worst reporting what another of Jesus' eyewitness said. Multiple independent sources
Yeah,
from
but
eyewitnesses.
for John, I think, I my sense is that the sort of most critical scholars think that John is, he doesn't provide no historical evidence, but you at least should take the historical stuff in John with quite a few pinches of salt, where it was written pretty far after the events in question. In terms of the stuff in Mark, I mean, remember, people can who were eyewitnesses of some event can incorrectly remember details about the event, or can think that things happened that just in fact did not happen.
Okay, so again, you've got Mark reporting what he remembered Peter saying, and you got the Gospel of John reporting, at worst, what another one of Jesus' disciples saying, multiple independent sources. So if you only have one that's reporting this, what you're saying has greater plausibility. When you have more than one independent source, especially when they're rooted carefully or closely in eyewitness testimony, that is a different matter altogether.
Yeah,
you're right when it comes to John's gospel. John is a little different animal than the synoptic gospels are, but there is a section called the John, Jesus in History, Jesus, John in History, one of the two, section at the Society of Biblical Literature that's been going on for well over a decade now. It's led by Paul Anderson, one of the leading Johannine scholars in the world. And Johannine scholars will say that more and more scholars are starting to recognize there's a whole lot of history in John. Now, what does John report it in the same manner that the synoptic gospels do? Well, as Paul Anderson says, it's more of a theological paraphrase. So in other words, John takes the traditions about Jesus of which he knew, and after years of reflection, he recast those in his own words with the deeper theological insights that he has gained over all those years. But he reports the same kind of stuff, like Jesus walking on water, Jesus raising the dead, Jesus being crucified, Jesus feeding the 5,000, Jesus rising from the dead. So we see that he's kind of paraphrasing things a little more loosely than the other gospel authors do, but the essence is still there.
Yeah. I mean, so I mean, I'm not sure. I have not looked especially carefully into how reliable the Gospel of John is. Unfortunately, I'm not a New Testament historian. I don't, but So I guess this will partly depend on how seriously you take John. But even if you think that what John is reporting is what the eyewitnesses reported, well, my claim is that the eyewitnesses could have developed false memories. So you said, if Mark's reporting on what Peter said, even if he is reporting on what Peter said, I mean, imagine in the bar mitzvah example where I incorrectly remember details about my bar mitzvah that I thought I remembered. Imagine some guy named Mark. He wanted to compile a biography of my life, so he writes about some details in my bar mitzvah. He could be wrong, even if he's accurately reporting the things I said, if I'm wrong. And my claim is that Peter, even if one of the early eyewitnesses, Mark relying on Peter, could be wrong for exactly the same reason.
Okay, so what if you said, I think I remember my bar mitzvah, sorry. And then your mom says, oh yeah, yep, you're right about that. I was there too. And then someone else, let's say you've got a sister, says, yeah, little brother, yeah, I was there too. That was a good time. So then it starts to look more like, hey, this bar mitzvah happened. And yeah, people do have false memories. I've had false memories. Sometimes like one time I grew up in Baltimore, and so the Baltimore Orioles were my team, baseball team. And I remembered Jim Palmer, the pitcher for the Orioles back in the 70s, that he hit an inside the park home run one Sunday afternoon. Well, I got a chance to talk to Jim years later, and I said, what was it like when you hit that inside the park home run back in the 70s? He said, well, I've hit some home runs, but I never hit an inside the park home run. So apparently what my memory did, Matthew, was, it's very rare for a pitcher to hit a home run anyway. And I took that rareness, the big event of him hitting a home run, and over time that got embellished, amplified to say it was an in the park home run. And there have been times like my wife and I, we have one of us messed up our memories. So, we remembered shortly after, a few years after we were married, we went to a hotel for a business meeting, and we unpacked, unpacked our stuff, and then we left the hotel room. We went to dinner. We went to some business meetings afterward. We came back to our room that night, and we walk in the room, and I said, "Debbie, someone's been in our room." She said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because look, the lights are on. We didn't put the lights on. It was light when we came in here. Listen, the radio was playing." And listen, we were kind of hillbillies back then. And I said, "Look, someone has pulled down the sheets on our bed and put 2 mints on it just to make sure we know that they were here." I had no idea about turn down service. I looked all around the room. I didn't find anybody, of course. And then I called the front desk and told them what we saw. "Someone's been in our room." And, "Well, why do you say that?" "Well, the radio's on, the lights are on. Someone pulled down our sheets and put mints on the pillows." "Well, Mr. Lacona, that's our turn down service. We do that for all our guests." Oh, hung up the phone. Of course, I'm sure they're laughing like crazy at the front desk. Well, my wife and I remember everything about that event exactly the same, except one thing. I say that event happened in Dallas, Texas, and my wife said it happened in Richmond, Virginia. Now, one of us got it wrong, probably her, but no, I don't know who got it wrong. But one of us, we went to business meetings in both of those cities, and one of us just misremembered the location. But we generally get things right. Listen, if our memory wasn't generally reliable, then we couldn't write biographies. We couldn't write histories. People would not be admitted as eyewitnesses in court. So we can cite examples of where people get their memories off, but our memories are generally reliable. And especially when you have multiple independent eyewitness sources or sources closely rooted in eyewitness testimony, it certainly increases the probability that what they were reporting is true.
Yeah, I certainly agree that our memories are in general reliable. But then the question is, okay, just what's the probability of that? And I agree part of this will be informed by your theological beliefs. So, if you're already inclined to think Christianity is pretty plausible, then you think, okay, if Christianity is right, it's decently likely that Jesus would predict his resurrection from the dead. But if you're inclined to think Christianity is pretty implausible, then I think that'll kind of make it so that you think it's a bit less likely.
But I think if you come at it in an open position, as neutral as you can, and you say, let's lay aside our worldviews, let's just be open, and you look at the data and you weigh it historically, then I think the data is there to say Jesus probably predicted his imminent death and resurrection. Did he use the exact words we find in the Gospels? Probably not. They are recalling it years later, but you do have multiple independent sources, so they're getting the gist of what Jesus said. He performs deeds that astonishes crowds. Again, he predicts his imminent death and resurrection, and then it seems that afterward people see him alive in individual and in group settings, friend and foe alike. That's some pretty good evidence, even if you just come at it. You have, look, Peter Crawford's a South African scholar. He's an atheist. He's a New Testament scholar. He's an atheist. We debated years ago. He and I are friends. He came up to me once at annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature. This was 2010. My big book on the resurrection just came out. I devote a section of chapter 5 in there to criticizing his view. He thanked me for being accurate, for quoting him accurately and representing his view accurately. And he said, "Mike, let me ask you a question. If God does not exist after all, despite what you argue for the resurrection, what do you think the probability is that Jesus rose from the dead?" I said, "Peter, I'd say if we knew for a fact that God doesn't exist, then despite any historical arguments that I've given, I'd have to rate it as practically 0. And he said, "I appreciate that." I said, "Now let me ask you, if God exists, and let's say we don't know anything about God, but if God exists, given the evidence we have for the resurrection of Jesus, how would you say, how probable is it that he rose from the dead?" He says, "It's very probable that he rose from the dead." So yeah, I agree with you that worldviews do weigh in with this. But my question is, if you step back from your worldview, if you bracket it, and you just look at the evidence and you say, I'm not going to assume Christianity is true. I'm not going to rule it out. I'm just going to look at this as a detached person, as detached as possible, interested in truth, knowing that if Christianity is not true, it could cost me eternity. Knowing that if Christianity is true and I reject it, it could cost me eternity. So it's important, but I'm not going to presuppose anything. I'm going to look at the data. Where would the data point? And I think it would point to the resurrection of Jesus if we look at it purely historically.
Yeah, so I think it depends on what you mean by if you look at it purely historically. So I agree if if you were 50-50 on Christianity, but you just hadn't looked at the resurrection evidence at all, you hadn't even considered it, and then you looked at the historical evidence, then I think you should end up
Matthew,
being
you
pretty
kind
sure
of broke up
Christianity's
and
right.
you froze there for a moment. I missed some of what you said. Would you
Oh, sorry.
go back
Sorry about
about
that.
10
Yeah.
seconds?
Yeah. So I think if you think that, like, you haven't looked at the resurrection evidence at all, and you're 50-50 on Christianity, and then you look at the resurrection evidence, okay, you should think Christianity is probably true, because Christianity, the story that God raised Jesus from the dead, in a vacuum, that's the best. That well explains the resurrection evidence. But my claim is that I think that there are, because to believe Christianity, you have to believe a lot of things that I think are antecedently unlikely. That'll make it so that Christianity is not a good view. Just like, if you were 50-50 before looking at the data, before looking at the historical data on the hypothesis that, I don't know, James coincidentally converted, as did Paul, and then there were some grief-induced hallucinations, and the story spread over time. If you hadn't looked at the historical evidence at all, then just from looking at the fact, okay, that theory predicts the relevant resurrection evidence. So you would say, yeah, okay, I guess that theory prior to looking at the evidence, after looking at the evidence, you would think that theory does better than before looking at the evidence. But because that theory is not antecedently very likely, because it requires believing this sort of large series of kind of odd coincidences, you think, okay, that's not a very good theory. Even if once you grant it, it explains the resurrection evidence. And my thoughts kind of similar about Christianity. Now, you mentioned sort of the eternal consequences, but I mean that's another thing where about the Christian explanation that I find improbable, where it's like what you believe about Jesus in this life has eternal consequences, where there's a hell that people will go to maybe forever, that will be a place of never-ending torment. I just, like, philosophically, that seems really improbable, and it seems like something that if you weren't already committed to Christianity, you wouldn't expect God to do that at the end of a person's life. And so I think that's a weird thing that you have to add to your belief system. That's as weird as any of the things that a non-Christian will have to add to their belief system in order to explain the resurrection.
Okay, let's talk about hell then, just for a second there. So Christian theologians have, over the centuries, have had disagreements on what the nature of hell is. And there's some decent reasons to think that more of a metaphorical view of hell is correct, rather than this kind of Dante's Inferno that we think of when we read some things literally in Scripture in that way, like the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever. So I think there's good reason to believe that a lot of this is metaphorical. Now, that is not to say that hell isn't a real place. It is to say that things such as the flames, the fires of hell, the worms of hell, where the worm does not die and the fire's never quenched in Mark chapter 9, that those things are metaphors for judgment. So, for example, in the book of Revelation, it talks about when Jesus returns in judgment, his tongue will be like a sword and his eyes will be flames of fire. Well, I don't expect that we're going to see flames coming out of his eye sockets, or a sword coming out of his mouth and decapitating some of his enemies. These are metaphors for judgment. When you hear about flames and fire that is never extinguished, and the worm that does not die, Jesus is referring to Isaiah, the very last chapter in Isaiah, where we get this picture of Israel's enemies have all been killed. They're slaughtered, And just like they did in antiquity, they would take the corpses and they'd stack them on top of each other in a big pile, and they'd set them ablaze to keep from disease spreading from those corpses. That's the picture we have at the end of Isaiah, that God has taken all of his enemies, that they are just corpses now, and it's on fire, and the maggots are eating away at these decomposing corpses. And God is saying by that in Isaiah, when their fire is never quenched and their worm does not die, it doesn't mean that that fire is never going to be extinguished or die out in that pile, or the maggots aren't going to die. What it means is that is metaphorical for saying that, hey, you don't have to worry about your enemies anymore. And so it could very well be, I'd say most Christian theologians today think that these descriptions of hell are a way of saying that God is going to, one of two things. He will either quarantine people away from his presence because they didn't really want anything to do with him during their life. And so, as C.S. Lewis said, there will be two kinds of people in the afterlife: those who said to God, "Your will be done," and those to whom God says, "Your will be done. You didn't want me during your life. You won't have me in the afterlife." And so he quarantines them forever away from his presence. Another view is that people will suffer punishment, and then after they are punished, they will fade away and to be annihilated. This would kind of be in line with the Isaiah passage. And that would seem to work with the justice of God as well. So I don't think that the concept of hell is necessarily as horrible as many people think that it is.
Yeah, well, so I guess, I mean, I don't find either of those concepts of hell to be at all philosophically plausible. Where, I actually think if I were a Christian, I'd be a universalist. Where I actually think that
why don't you find them plausible?
Well, so I mean, I guess so. We can talk first about the C.S. Lewis one. So I mean, I think if one commits only a finite crime, they only deserve a finite punishment for the finite crime. And so even if
why would that not be in line with, say, the annihilationist view that I mentioned a moment ago?
Yeah. Well, so my view is, I think that if one is in a position to make another infinitely well off, for at least most people, okay, maybe there are some exceptions like really horrible people, but at least in most cases, if you have the ability to make someone infinitely well off, you ought to do so. And I think God is in a position to make people infinitely well off. So you'd expect an infinitely long lasting and infinitely good afterlife, conditional on the truth of theism, especially because I think that, and this will get into some other more contentious philosophical views, but I think that any time a person acts wrongly, that stems in some way from immorality. It stems in from irrationality. That it stems from immorality. That's not controversial at all. Where I think that, just as it's irrational to not care what happens to yourself in the future just because it's sometime in the future, to procrastinate, let's say. I think in a similar way, there's a similar irrationality involved in people not acting in people acting immorally, where they arbitrarily don't care about the interests of others. Now, if you have a view like that, then God, by equipping us with suitable rational faculties, would be in a position to eventually get us to act in accordance with the good by having us appreciate the moral reasons for acting rightly. Now, if you're either in a position to reform someone such that they eventually become good and then enjoy an infinitely good afterlife, or you're in a position to just cause them to suffer a little bit and then just be destroyed and then die, essentially. Well, it seems any decent being would reform the being, because being morally good and happy is better than being miserable for a bit and then being dead.
Well, I'm open to God doing that.
Yeah. Well, so I think it's it's possible that God does that, and you can think you can be a universalist Christian, and that's what I would be if I were a Christian. But it's at least a little bit suspicious. Well, for one, I don't think you would expect post-mortem punishment at all, conditional on theism. And I think even if you do have a reason to accept post-mortem punishment of some sort, and the Bible is very clear that at least there's a temporary hell. Maybe it's not clear, this stuff about that it's eternal, but it's at least temporary, and I don't think that's what you would expect. And then it's odd. Like if all you knew was that God was going to come down to earth and give some teachings, that he would be so ambiguous about the doctrine of hell that leads huge numbers of Christians that leads many billions of people all around the world to believe this really appalling doctrine that basically anyone who goes to the grave having the wrong beliefs, not believing in in Jesus Christ, infants even in some cases with a lot of Calvinists, that they'll suffer.
I'm not
forever.
a Calvinist, so
Yeah. No, right. I wasn't saying you were a Calvinist. I was just saying you would expect, like, it's very odd just that his teachings would be sufficiently ambiguous such that so many people misinterpret it, and even misinterpret it in these really grotesque ways, e.g. the Calvinists, I think, misinterpreted it in these really grotesque ways, where like you would expect, I think, clearer teachings where such that lots of people don't end up believing these kind of implausible doctrines.
I guess, well, God doesn't promise anywhere in Scripture the perspicuity of Scripture, that it's going to be clear, so clear that there's can't be any possibility of misinterpreting. And look, today, even with other things, you've got some people out there, people like Richard Kerr, who say Jesus never existed. That's something that hardly anyone goes with that, at least, sober-minded historians. Carrier himself has a list of, I think, 43 scholars that he says they either doubt Jesus' existence or think that it's a legitimate question. But out of those, he only names 16 of those 43 who doubt Jesus' existence. The other 27 are a matter of, well, we don't think you're crazy if you doubt Jesus' existence, but we believe that he existed. So he's only got 16, including himself, who doubt Jesus existed. And of those, 3 of them are dead. So there's only 13 living scholars in the universe today who doubt Jesus existed. If there were only 13 scholars in the universe who thought Jesus rose from the dead, we would be laughed at. But there's only 13 scholars who think Jesus never existed, who doubt his existence. So are we going to say that God can't allow someone who rejects him to go off the deep end like that? Or even people who want to come to the right ideas about God, that they're not going to make wrong decisions about, babies going to hell because they weren't part of the elect because they're Calvinists? God doesn't control our thinking in that sense. So not everybody, as you said, as you have admitted, not everybody is going to be thinking rationally all the time. We're all going to have some false beliefs. I'm sure I've got some false beliefs. Hopefully they will be corrected in time. The thing about God, though, the thing about eternal punishment, that troubles me. I hope the annihilationist view is true rather than more of the Dante's Inferno. I don't think the Dante's Inferno thing is true. I think it's more either the metaphorical view that God quarantines people away from his presence forever, or the annihilationist view is true. I hope it's the annihilationist view. But you know what? I don't get to tell God or consult with him or encourage him to take a certain view. If I were God, I think maybe I would do things differently, but maybe if I were God, I'd know why he's doing things the way he is. But even if I don't like God, if the evidence is there that he exists and is who he is, well, I'm still going to worship him because I fear him. So I'm not like some of these atheists you find online, like a Matt Dillahunty, who says, even if he knew for certain that Christianity is true, he still wouldn't become a Christian. And it's like, no, look, I don't like Islam. I don't like the Islamic God. But if Islam was true, I would worship the Islamic God. Why? Because I fear him. So I'm just more concerned with the evidence than I am some of these things. I agree with you that some things, I think maybe one of the strongest arguments against the existence of God would be the problem of evil, pain, and suffering. I think when it comes to human beings, that isn't as difficult as it is with something that you mentioned, and that is animal suffering. I think that makes, I admit, I think that makes the that that strengthens things in terms of the problem of evil, pain, and suffering. I don't know how to address it. I suppose I could come up with some possibilities. I haven't focused on the problem of evil as some other philosophers like Alvin Plantinga and others have. But I will say that at the very worst, all that does is call into question the character of God. It doesn't call into question his existence.
Yeah. Well, so I agree that if you were if I were convinced that the Calvinist God existed or that the Muslim God existed or something, I would worship them just for like prudential reasons. I don't want to get tortured forever. But I mean, I think the like you should think that God probably is good, just because I think the philosophical arguments. If you don't have the assumption that God is good, then just most of the philosophical arguments go out the window. So why expect God to make a finely tuned universe? Well, if you think God is good, it's because a finely tuned universe is good. But if you don't think that God is good, then why think he'd make a finely tuned universe? Why think? I mean, I know you like the moral argument for God.
Yeah.
So why think? How could this indifferent being ground objective moral values? I also think that a good God is simpler, because you just posit one thing, which is a perfect being, rather than this being with these very arbitrary desires. So I think I'd be more confident just in the bare existence of God than in any of a good God than in any particular religion. And then I think once you think that there is a good God, then if a particular religion gives teachings that you think are incompatible with a good God, so the teachings of the Muslim God, for example, I think those are wholly incompatible with goodness. That gives you reason to think, well, okay, probably that's not the God, because the real God that's out there is a perfect being, to the extent that there is one out there. And
Yeah, I agree. That's reasonable. I guess for me, I look at it and I'd say, yeah, I don't understand animal suffering. I do struggle somewhat with the concept of hell. But I do believe that God is all good. I believe he's merciful and just. And so based on that, because I do believe he's good, I think that if these things are true, then he has a morally justifiable reason for holding these things that I just don't know at this point.
yeah, yeah. I mean, you can think that, but then the question is just, what are the odds that there in fact is a good reason to condemn people either to an eternal hell or to annihilate them? And that's only scratching the surface with the seemingly immortal things in both the Old and New Testament. But I know you said you had to go after about an hour, and we've been going for a bit over an hour.
Now, let me just say one final thing with that, well, now I forgot what I was going to say. What was the last thing you said? Anyway, sorry. It's my mind's getting a little fuzzy here.
Yeah.
But Matthew, hey, this has been an enjoyable discussion with you. You're a bright young man, and thank you for inviting me to join you on here.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. I think I think your stuff on the resurrection is I think very convincing, and well, I mean, maybe I overstated that slightly. I'm not convinced by it, but I think you're one of the smartest and ablest scholars defending the minimal facts case for the resurrection. And I think if people are looking for who the best people are defending the minimal facts argument and defending what I think is the best argument for the resurrection, look to Mike and Gary Habermas are the people to go to. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. I think this has been a good chat. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for watching,
Thanks,
everyone.
Matthew, and all the best to you. I appreciate the kind words.
Thank you.